My name is Idris Al-Mansur, and every time I close my eyes and go back in time, I remember my life before that morning, a life that seemed to fit together perfectly. There was a sense of order to everyday life, almost as if everything followed an invisible script. I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan, a city where being Muslim was not an exception, but rather part of the fabric of society. It was common to see mosques on the way to school, hear the call to prayer echoing at holy times, and share celebrations with friends who understood the rituals that shaped our lives. In my home, Islam was not just a belief. It was the air we breathed, the sound of the morning, and the structure of the evening. It was present in the words of my father, Khalid, a man of few expression but deep conviction, always with a serious look on his face. He was the pillar of the family. For him, discipline and faith were inseparable. Prayer, reading the Quran, respect for traditions, all were law. My mother, Aina, was the exact counterpoint to this rigidity. Loving, soft-spoken, and always full of hands to help others. She was the one who made sure that the faith was not only followed, felt. No matter who knocked on our door, Muslim, Christian, Jew, or none of the three, she welcomed them with a smile and a plate of food. Idris, my father would say in a deep, slow voice, faith is not just what we believe. Faith is how we live. Never forget that. And I didn't. I wore those words like armor. I would wake before dawn for the Salat al-Fajr, still fighting sleep but obeying the sacred call. At school, I would stay away from those who mocked the religion or engaged in things I considered wrong. When I heard something that contradicted the teachings of Islam, I would hold it in my mind as a reminder that the world outside was corrupt and that we, the righteous, were few. But what I didn't realize was that, little by little, my faith was being contaminated by something quieter and more dangerous: pride. I would look at other Muslim colleagues who didn't follow the rituals with such zeal, and, without saying anything, I would judge them internally. It was as if my devotion elevated me above others, even those who shared the same faith. Christians, Jews, atheists, I viewed them with a mixture of pity and pride. I felt as if I had access to a truth that they simply ignored. I vividly remember a conversation with my friend Rasan during a break. He seemed uncomfortable that day, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. When I asked him, he quietly confessed that he had missed one of the 5 prayers that day. Without thinking much, I asked, "Do you think God forgives us when we are so careless?" I didn't mean to hurt his feelings, but my tone came out harsh and judgmental. Rasan hesitated, looking at the ground. "I guess so. God is merciful, isn't he?" He tried to smile as if asking for approval, but I just shook my head, feeling like he was taking something sacred too lightly. "Yes, he is merciful," I replied, "but he is also just. We can't expect forgiveness without effort." At that moment, I felt even more certain of my righteousness. I thought that, unlike Rasan, I would never let my faith waver. I believed that God saw my daily surrender and would reward me for it. Now, I look back and realize how narrow my vision was. I thought I understood faith completely, when in fact, I was trapped in a version of it that left little room for compassion, for doubt, for learning. My home, with its clear rules and fixed routines, gave me the illusion of control. But I didn't yet know that that control would be ripped away from me without warning. The morning that changed everything began like any other. It was still dark outside, but my cell phone alarm rang at 5:15, insistent and familiar. I got up slowly, my eyes still heavy. My body wanted more sleep, but habit spoke louder. I walked in silence to the bathroom. The cold water from the ablution touched my skin, and between the splashes and murmurs of purification, something seemed out of place. My movements were slow, as if the air had become thicker. My mind wandered. There was a subtle but real restlessness. As I wiped my face, I heard my mother's voice coming from the kitchen, as tender as ever. "Idris, are you okay?" She was stirring the coffee on the stove, and her tone held a concern that struck me as new, as if she too sensed that something was about to change, and she was right. My mother's voice had a different tone that morning. There was a tension in it that I didn't notice until later, as if she could already sense what was coming. "Yeah, Mom, just a little tired," I said, trying to hide my discomfort with a smile I could barely manage. I didn't want to worry her. She was already so dedicated to all of us. I went back to my room, my feet dragging on the cold floor, and started changing for school. It was at that moment, as I was pulling my shirt off my shoulders, that I felt a sudden dizziness, as if the ground beneath me had lost its hold. Instinctively, I reached out and held onto the wall. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to compose myself. I took a deep breath. Maybe I'm just hungry, I thought, trying to rationalize what I was feeling. At home, fasting was part of our practice, and I sometimes skipped breakfast to strengthen my spiritual discipline. But this was different. Still, I continued to dress, fighting the weakness that was beginning to spread like a thick fog through my body. My arms felt heavy. My legs felt like they were made of sand. The sound of the television in the living room and my mother's familiar murmur in the kitchen were still there, but they seemed to come from far, far away, as if I were listening to the world underwater. I grabbed my backpack, or at least I tried. I took 2 steps toward the living room, and then another wave of dizziness hit, stronger, more overwhelming. My knees simply gave out, and everything around me began to spin and then go black. The last thing I heard was my mother shouting my name, "Idris!" as if her voice had to travel through a tunnel to reach me. Her footsteps were running toward me, but my vision was already dissolving into shadows. And then, silence. A silence so absolute that it seemed to nullify the very concept of sound. There was no floor, no walls, no sky. There was no body, just an infinite calm void. Did I die? The question arose in my mind, but it didn't feel like a question asked in desperation. It was more like a realization, accompanied by a strange relief. In the midst of that total darkness, something began to change. First, a small light, so distant, it seemed like a lonely star in space, but it was getting closer and growing, fast, bright, intense. Soon it was no longer a light. It was a light, bright, yet soft, warm, yet comforting. It was as if it had its own consciousness and enveloped me with a caress that was impossible to describe. I floated toward her. Yes, I floated, because I no longer had a body. There was no weight, only consciousness. And within that light, a peace I had never felt before, a peace that came not from control or rigid obedience, but from a deep, loving, total presence. I felt, for the first time in my life, that I belonged somewhere without having to prove anything. And then something happened. From the center of the light, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was just a soft outline, like a shadow cast by the light itself. But as it got closer, the shape became clearer. Shoulders, arms, a face. When I finally saw him, I stopped. I literally stopped, even though I didn't have a body. I stood there, suspended in time and space, in front of something that my mind couldn't comprehend, but my heart immediately recognized. Era Jesus Christ. I had no doubts. I didn't need to ask. The certainty was in me as if it had always been there, hidden beneath layers of convictions that I thought were unshakable. His eyes, or what I understood as eyes, looked at me with an intensity that pierced through everything I had ever been and everything I thought I was. There were no words. He didn't need to speak. It was as if every part of me was being read, understood, and loved. There was a love there that transcended anything I had ever known, a love that didn't judge, didn't demand perfection, just welcomed. But there was something else, too, a sadness, a silent pain in Jesus' eyes, as if he carried the weight of all of humanity's bad decisions, including mine. And yet he stood there, steadfast, with compassion that seemed to have no end. At that moment, something began to break inside me, something old, rigid, built over the years on fear, pride, and false security. And in its place, something new began to grow. Still fragile, still nameless, but alive, very much alive. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew, with a clarity I had never had before, that my life would never be the same. My mind, still shaped by the beliefs I had carried since childhood, was in conflict. Jesus, I thought, confused. Why him? Why not Prophet Muhammad? Peace be upon him. Everything inside me seemed to want to return to the familiar structure of the faith that had guided me throughout my life. And yet, there was Jesus, present, silent, unmistakable. It was as if he already knew what I was feeling. Before my thoughts could even fully form, he reached out his hand, not touching me, just bringing it closer. And suddenly, an indescribable warmth enveloped my being. But it wasn't a physical warmth. It was as if love itself had a temperature, a love so pure, so unconditional, that it dissolved for a few moments all my defenses. I was speechless, although in that state, I didn't even have a mouth to speak. It was my soul that responded, and in that absolute silence, I felt as if he were saying, not with voice, but with essence, I did not come to erase what you believe. I came to show you what lies beyond. It was then that a stream of images began to appear before me. They were not mere vision. It was like watching a movie, but one projected directly from the light emanating from him. I did not just see with my eyes, I felt with my entire being. In the first scene, world leaders sat at long conference table. The atmosphere was heavy, dense, the lights cold, and the faces etched with tension. I saw voices overlapping, hands pounding on wood, arguments driven by anger, fear, and, above all, greed. Among them all, one face stood out: Benjamin Netanyahu. His countenance became almost symbolic. Not just a man, but a representation of the human decisions that move entire world. Other faces appeared, but less clearly. Shadows of leaders, of figures of power. I saw forests in flames, seas darkened by oil and garbage, cities torn apart by the sound of missiles. I saw people fleeing, screaming, dying, and others just watching in silence. And through it all, a message emerged, crystal clear. These are the fruits of free will, when it is used without compassion. My being reacted with something I can only call tears of the soul. They were pure emotions, without the need for words. I cried, not with my eyes, but with every part of my consciousness. I realized, with a piercing pain, how much I had never really reflected on these things. In my search for righteousness, I had never stopped to really look at the world, at the suffering of others, at the collective consequences of indifference. Then Jesus showed me something even more personal. I saw myself, kneeling in prayer. My lips were moving, reciting the sacred verses, my body positioned with precision. But there was something wrong. Between me and the divine, there was an invisible barrier, something that prevented that prayer from reaching, from flowing. My heart ached. Then, he showed me moments in my life where my faith had become routine. I saw my own religious gestures being done mechanically, without soul, as if fulfilling an obligation to prove that I am worthy, but without love, without compassion, without true surrender. The reality hit me hard. I had used faith as armor, but not as a bridge. And then came another message, not with voice, but with presence. It doesn't matter what name you use to call me. What matters is the love you share, the compassion you live. I remained silent, deeply touched. It was as if everything inside me was being remade, reorganized, reborn. Jesus remained there, silent now, as if offering the necessary time for the planted seeds to germinate. The light around him pulsed gently, like the beating of an eternal heart, and I felt something growing inside me, a deep desire to understand, to change, to love differently. The light began to expand again, and this time it created a new space. It wasn't just visions. It was like to live each scene, like being inside a memory that wasn't mine, but that I could feel as if it were. The first scene took me back to that shadowy table of world leaders. The voices were even louder. The atmosphere was stifling. I saw Benjamin Netanyahu again, his face rigid, burdened with difficult decisions and heavy consequences. There was tension in the air, but also something deeper. The sense that many of these decisions came from hearts blinded by conviction, pain, and fear. Other leaders were there too, some debating with patriotic conviction, others clearly driven by vested interests. But what really surprised me was feeling their emotion. I could hear their words, yes, but more than that, I felt the doubts, the fears, the regrets hidden behind public faces. And then I realized none of them were completely good or evil. They were all human, and they were all lost in some way. This revelation struck me. The world was more complex than any doctrine could explain alone, and in that space of light and awareness, faith, love, and truth seemed to be intertwined in a way I had never understood before. Consumed by greed and ambition, the leaders in that room seemed blind to the consequences of their choices. And then the light emanating from Jesus, alive, conscious, began to envelop the scene, as if to protect what could still be saved. A clear and firm message arose within me, not in spoken words, but in pure understanding. The fate of humanity does not rest solely in the hands of its leaders, but in the choices of each individual. Yet those with power have a greater responsibility, for their decisions shape the paths of many. The image slowly faded away, like sand being blown away by the wind, and another took its place. Now I saw the earth bleed. Forests, once green and vibrant, were ablaze, burning like open wounds. The sky was thick with smoke. I heard the crack of falling trees, the desperate rustling of animals trying to escape. Then the oceans appeared, vast but darkened, covered in black slicks of oil that floated like wounds on the blue skin of the planet. I saw seabirds drenched in oil, dead fish adrift. The sound of rushing water, once gentle, now came like violent torrents, carrying with it trash, sewage, and despair. And once again, the message came, sharp and true. These are not punishment. They are consequences. The earth gives back what humans put into it. Balance can be restored, but it will require sacrifice and love. My heart sank. I wanted to look to Jesus, to seek comfort in the presence that radiated peace. But the light did not allow it. It guided me to the next lesson. Before me lay a city in ruin. Not physically. The buildings were still standing, but spiritually, there was something rotten in the air. Groups of people fought each other in the streets, divided by skin color, religion, politics, everything that made them different, and blind to what made them the same. Shouts echoed, signs were held up, but no one really listened. I saw eyes filled with rage, faces distorted by hatred. It was chaos, without listening, without empathy. In the midst of the tumult, some knelt in prayer, seeking something beyond themselves, but they were few. Most were lost in the deafening noise of their own ego. The following message came as a deep whisper within me. You are all made of the same essence, but as long as this truth is ignored, peace will be impossible. It was then that something unexpected happened. The light began to dim, slowly, as if the heart of the universe itself were slowing down. Darkness took hold, not as an absence of light, but as the active presence of something suffocating. Within it, I heard screams, not of physical pain, but of existential despair. They were voices trapped in an eternal echo of emptiness. I saw people wandering, their faces obscured, as if covered in shadow. There was no hatred in them, just absence, as if they had forgotten who they were or why they existed. Jesus' presence intensified again, his light slowly returning, bringing back warmth, meaning, and his message came clear, like a silent thunder. This is the future without love, without compassion. But then, with infinite tenderness, he added, there is still hope. There is always hope. And the light changed again, this time softer, more welcoming. I began to see different scenes, small, almost inconspicuous at first glance, but deeply moving. I saw a woman feeding a homeless man. I saw children planting trees with their hands covered in dirt and their eyes full of joy. I saw neighbors rebuilding homes after a flood, even though they didn't know each other well. I saw leaders giving up privileges to protect the most vulnerable. And with each act of kindness, something miraculous happened. The world breathed, the earth responded, the waters became cleaner, the skies became clearer, and people, they smiled, a genuine smile, the kind that comes from inner peace. The final message came like a silent hug that touched my soul. Every choice counts. No matter how small it seems, every act of love is a seed for a better future. I was ecstatic. A part of me wanted to stay there forever, enveloped in that light, that truth, that presence. But another, more restless part knew I had to go back. How could I take all this back to the world? How can I put into words what barely fits inside me? I didn't know. but something inside me, perhaps the light itself, said, "You must try." The mission was not to convince, it was to testify. The light seemed to confirm this call. It enveloped me like a cloak of warmth and purpose, as if to say, "You are not alone." And the figure of Jesus, still radiant, remained before me, silent, but closer than ever. His gaze still carried the love that transcends time, and now it also carried trust. And it was at that moment that something new began to happen. A different kind of energy filled the space around me. The light that had previously surrounded me from the outside now seemed to come from within, as if something had been ignited within me. Jesus' presence remained constant, but now it was intimate, connected directly to my essence. And before I could even ask questions or understand what was happening, new images began to emerge. But this time, they weren't of the world, not even from other people. They were about me. The images that were emerging now were not of wars, nor of nature collapsing, nor of distant leaders. They were me, moments taken directly from my own story. At first, I confess, I didn't understand why. The first scene seemed simple, almost banal. Me, about 8 years old, kneeling next to my father on a prayer rug. He recited verses from the Quran in that deep, steady voice that filled the room. As a small child, I stared at the floor, repeating the verses in a nervous whisper. My goal was not to understand, it was to not make mistakes. I wanted to get every word, every intonation right, for fear of disappointing him. And now, reliving the scene, I felt it all again, but with much greater clarity. I felt the anxiety of my childish self, the weight of my father's silent pride, and, above all, I noticed a detail I had never noticed before, the absence of my heart in that prayer. It was there, but not there, present. It was a silent performance, not an encounter with the divine. The scene vanished like smoke on the wind, and a new image took its place. I was now about 12 years old, in an argument at school with a classmate named Daniel. He was a Christian, and I was trying to convince him, with arrogant conviction, that his faith was wrong. The memory was painfully vivid. I remember crossing my arms, looking him straight in the eye, and saying, almost accusingly, "I'm not a Christian. How can you believe something so illogical? If God sent a final prophet, why follow something that came before him?" Daniel was silent for a moment. He looked down and mumbled something I couldn't hear, or maybe I didn't even care to hear. At the time, I felt victorious. I thought I had won a debate. But now, as I looked back on the scene, I realized what had really happened. I had hurt him, not with my words, but with my judgment. I didn't want to share light. I wanted to win. I didn't seek understanding. I wanted to prove superiority. And in that desire, I denied the essence of what I claimed to represent. The image slowly faded, replaced by something even more intimate, an ordinary night. I was sitting on the floor of my room, reciting the evening prayer. The voice came automatically from my mouth, but my thoughts wandered. I was worried about schoolwork, about a test the following week, about everyday problems. Prayer, at that moment, was just an item on my daily list. Something to be done, checked off, overcome. And then, in the silence of that memory, something whispered inside me. A voice that came not from outside, but from my own soul. You were not wrong in seeking faith, but you lost yourself in the form and forgot the essence. Love is the basis of all true faith. The light that surrounded me pulsed more intensely, as if it beat to the same rhythm as my heart, and with each beat, more memories emerged, some beautiful, others difficult to face. I saw the day I helped our elderly neighbor carry his shopping bags up to the 3rd floor without being asked. I remember the gratitude on his face and the warmth it brought me. But then I saw another moment, the one when I ignored a classmate's request for help with his studies because I didn't have time. I was too busy with my own tasks. The truth, I just didn't want to be bothered. I saw everything, all, with painful clarity. But strangely, there was no condemnation. There was no accusing voice, no punishment. There was only understanding, a pure truth. Faith without love is empty, no matter how devout you appear to be. If there is no compassion, it is just a ritual. The visions ended as gently as they had begun. I stood there, enveloped in a silence that seemed to embrace everything: the regret, the relief, the new understanding. It was as if a weight I had been carrying without knowing it had finally been lifted. I understood deeply that my life was not about memorizing sacred words, blindly following rules, or proving myself more righteous than others. My life, my faith, needed to be lived with authenticity, with heart, with purpose. It needed to be born of love, of presence, of empathy. And there he was, Jesus, still before me. His presence was light, but it was also silent. He didn't judge me. He didn't correct me. He just stood there. He looked at me as if he already knew everything, and yet he loved me completely. There was no demand in his gaze. There was only a choice. You can continue living mechanically. Or, he said without words, you can begin to live with true faith, the one that transforms not only you, but the world around you. After that dive into the memories of my own life, full of revelations, truths, and regrets, I felt that something even greater was about to happen. The light around Jesus began to pulse again, but this time there was a change in the air. It was as if the universe itself had held its breath, waiting for a decisive moment. An absolute silence enveloped me, not empty, but charged with meaning, as if everything was about to converge into a single instant. Jesus was still there, radiating that intense peace, that love that went through me like fire and tenderness at the same time. But now there was something different in his gaze, a calm, serious, like someone about to entrust something deeply important. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just held out his hand. And when he did, the space around us opened up into a new vision, even more vivid than all the ones before. It was as if I were looking down at the world from afar, but at the same time seeing everything clearly and intimately. The earth was spinning slowly before me, and around it, scenes from millions of lives were unfolding at the same time. In one corner, I saw a child crying alone in a dry field, starving. In another, a family was embracing one another amid the rubble of a house destroyed by a natural disaster. Further on, a woman was placing a plate of food in the trembling hands of a homeless man. Small gestures, great pain, a mosaic of suffering and love, intertwined in real time. But between these scenes of compassion, there were flashes of darkness. They were human figures, many of them, but their faces were covered in shadow, as if they had lost their very identity. Their actions were driven by fear, by hatred, by greed. I saw communities being divided, lies being spread, indifference becoming the norm. Those dark faces seemed unaware of the weight of their choices, or perhaps they just didn't care. It was then that, for the first time, I heard something direct and unmistakable, a clear voice, not coming from outside, but rising from within me, as if my soul were being touched by a truth that had always been there, waiting to be heard. The world is at a turning point. Every action matters. Every choice shapes the future, and you have a role to play. My heart raced. I felt a mixture of awe and fear. A paper? Me? I was just a 16-year-old boy, struggling to be a good Muslim, trying to figure out life, navigating doubts, expectations, pressures. How could I make a difference in a world so vast and so broken? But Jesus seemed to know exactly what was going on inside me. His presence soothed my uneasiness like a calm breeze on a rough sea. He didn't say anything, but something about him, perhaps his eyes or the very light that surrounded him, gave me reassurance, as if to say, you already have everything you need. You just need to start. It was then that he showed me one last vision. I was back in my city, walking the same streets I had always known, but something was different. I found myself interacting with people, not in extraordinary ways, not with speeches or miracle, but with simple gestures. I helped a neighbor change a tire. I comforted a friend who was crying inside, even as he smiled on the outside. I offered a snack to a homeless person I had usually ignored. And with each gesture, invisible ripples spread around me, touching lives I had never even known. The message was crystal clear. You don't have to change the whole world. You have to change the world around you. And every act of love no matter how small, leaves a trail of light that goes beyond what you can see. Then the decisive moment arrived. The light around me began to intensify, as if the universe was asking me something, waiting for me. I felt, with immense clarity, that I had a choice to make. Stay there, in that place of indescribable peace, far from the pain of the world, far from rejection, judgment, doubt, or return. Return to my body, to the routine, to the suspicious looks, to the unanswered question. Return, but with a mission, with a living truth inside me. The voice, faceless, soundless, echoed softly but firmly. Choose. Both paths are valid, but only one will allow you to continue growing and help others grow too. I closed my eyes, if I still had them that way, and felt. I didn't think, I just felt. And my heart bowed to the earth. I knew that going back meant pain. It meant doubt. It meant carrying something that perhaps no one else understood. But it also meant hope. It meant purpose. And when that decision was made, something inside me clicked. The light began to fade slowly, like the end of a sunset that leaves no darkness, but a trail of promise. The presence of Jesus began to move away, not as if he were leaving, but as if he were remaining in another form, more silent, more interior. I felt he was still with me, and always would be. But now, the next step was mine. Before the presence of Jesus disappeared completely, I felt one last message sink in, not into my mind, but into what I can only call my soul. Live with love, spread compassion. The rest will follow. That sentence reverberated within me like an eternal song, even as the light dissolved. Then, in a flash of awareness, everything changed. When I opened my eyes, I was immediately overcome by a strange duality. Everything seemed familiar: the cold white of the fluorescent lights, the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the rough sheet beneath my body. And yet, at the same time, everything felt profoundly distant, as if I were returning to a world that no longer belonged to me in the same way. My vision was blurry, shapes blurred, as if in a dream about to disappear. But then, slowly, my mother's face emerged from the haze. She was bent over me, her eyes red, filled with relief and concern. Her hands were gripping mine so tightly, it was as if she were trying to anchor me to life with her own touch. "Alhamdulillah, you're back," she said, through tears. "Idris, you gave us such a scare." I tried to smile, but my throat was dry, and my soul heavy. It was like trying to put an ocean inside a bottle. How could I explain that I had been somewhere else, outside of time, outside of my body, outside of everything we knew? My father, Khalid, walked in shortly afterward, more serious than ever, but his eyes were softer than I remembered. His tone was still firm, but there was something brittle there, a crack in the armor of a man of faith and discipline. It was a syncope, the doctor said. It could be related to blood pressure, or the heart, he explained, as if he was still trying to convince himself that everything was just physical, just biological. "Your mother found you unconscious and called the ambulance in time." I nodded slightly. Or at least I tried. My body was exhausted, as if I had traveled 1,000 kilometers inside myself. I wanted to speak, to tell everything, to shout. I saw the light. I saw Jesus. I understood things I never thought possible, but nothing came out. How to put into words something so vast, so sacred, so beyond? "I'm fine, Dad," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse, shaky, and half-lying. Because, well, I wasn't. I was different, deeply. My mother cried again, this time with emotion, and my father, the man who had always been a rock, leaned over and placed his hand on my head, whispering a prayer of gratitude in Arabic. I closed my eyes for a moment, not only from the emotion, but also from the weight that was falling on me. How could I tell them that the boy they had raised, so devoted, so full of certainty, was no more? Soon the room was filled with doctors, nurses, technical voices, medical jargon, papers to sign. The machine next to me beeped softly, monitoring my life, but only the part they could see. The rest, the invisible part, no one there seemed to notice. And that was when I began to feel truly out of place. The world seemed louder, faster, harder, as if I were hearing everything with new ears, seeing with eyes that saw more than appearances. Everything seemed out of place, like when you try to put on a pair of shoes you wore as a child and realize they no longer fit. Later, when I was finally alone in my room, I let the silence envelop me. I closed my eyes, trying to mentally recreate that light, that warmth, that presence that had touched me so deeply. But it wasn't there in the same way anymore. It was just a memory now, powerful, yes, but distant, like a soft scent that lingers in the air after the person has gone. I put my hand to my forehead, trying to find some physical sign, some visible trace of what I had experienced. Nothing, just my breathing, my body, and the immensity of what I now carried inside me. My mother came back with my Quran and placed it lovingly on the table beside my bed. "Here, my son, I know you find comfort in this," she said, with a smile full of tenderness. "Thank you, Mom," I replied, genuinely grateful. But I didn't touch the book at that moment. I just stared at it, that same book I had recited so many times with devotion, but automatically. Now, each verse seemed to carry an invitation, a call, not to rigidity, but to essence, not to pride, but to love, not to prove faith, but toto live faith. That night, lying in the white solitude of a hospital room, I made a silent promise. I didn't know it yet, as I had no idea where to start, but I knew I had to try. The mission I had been given was not about public greatness. It was about small, daily revolution, about loving better, listening more, judging less, and maybe, one day, when the time is right, I will tell my story. Not to convince, but to remind the world that love, when lived with truth, can transform even the most hardened soul. And sometimes, it is at the exact moment when everything seems to fall apart that God rebuilds us from within. The mission was never to convert anyone, nor to challenge other people's beliefs. It was something much simpler, and at the same time infinitely more difficult, living with love, spreading compassion, and helping others see that regardless of religion or the names we use for God, we are all part of something bigger. After a few days in the hospital, I was released. I returned home, but the city I had always known, Dearborn, with its familiar streets, the sounds of the mosques at prayer time, the smells of food at the local Arab market, all felt different now, as if the world had been washed clean and put back together, but in a slightly altered order. I was still Idris al-Mansur, but not the same Idris. I carried something inside me that I couldn't put into words, and that isolated me, even when I was surrounded by people. My parents treated me with extreme care, as if I were made of glass, as if they could protect me from a relapse with just a look. My mother watched me with worried tenderness, and my father, even in his usual rigidity, began to ask simple questions. "Are you sleeping well? Did you feel anything strange today?" "I'm fine," I replied. But the truth is that it wasn't the body that changed. It was the soul. The first time I tried to talk about what I had experienced was with my two closest friends, Rasan and Omar. It was some break, the same noisy cafeteria, the same familiar faces around, but what I carried with me was not something to be said lightly. "I need to tell you something," I began, looking at the two of them with some hesitation. Something that happened while I was passed out. Rasan shifted, curious. Omar, as always, made fun. "Did you see an angel, or did you go straight to heaven?" I smiled, a little embarrassed, but continued. "It wasn't exactly that. It was deeper. I saw Jesus." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. "Jesus." Rasan frowned. "What do you mean, Idris? You're Muslim." "I know, and that's why it's so hard to explain. But it was real. He showed me things about the world, about what really matters, about love." Omar laughed, a little nervously, as if trying to dispel the discomfort with a joke. "This sounds like church preaching, brother. Are you sure you didn't hit your head?" Rasan, however, remained silent. His eyes searched mine. "Do you think this means something? That God is trying to show you something?" I felt a deep relief, not because he understood completely, but because he at least allowed the doubt to exist. "Yes, I think it means that we are more connected than we imagine, that the name we give to God matters less than the love we live." He was quiet for a moment, but then looked away uncomfortably. Omar shrugged and walked away to another table. And there, In that brief moment, I understood something that would be confirmed many times later. People are not always ready to hear what challenges their structures. At home, it wasn't much different. I tried, carefully, to mention Jesus in conversation with my mother. She immediately frowned, visibly disturbed. "Idris, you were sick. Sometimes the heart plays tricks. Dreams get confused with reality. Allah is the only guide. Trust in our path, my son." And my father, well, my father was direct as always. "That is not something you should say around here. Islam is clear, and the Quran is the truth. Don't get confused." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them that my faith had not disappeared, but that it had expanded, blossomed in ways I never imagined possible. But looking into their eyes, I realized that it was useless at that moment, that what I had experienced still did not fit into the words they were ready to hear. So I chose silence. But not an empty silence. It was a silence that held within itself a decision. If I couldn't speak, I would live that. Even if no one understood, I would start with actions, with seeds. The following week, I went to visit my elderly neighbor, Mr. Mitchell, a Christian man who lived alone at the end of our street. I asked him if he needed help with anything. He looked at me with surprise, as if I were a stranger. But then he smiled with quiet gratitude and said yes, the lawn needed mowing. In school, I began to listen more than I spoke, especially in religion and history classes. Instead of engaging in arguments to prove I was right, I listened. And when I spoke, I did so calmly and with empathy. I tried to see people beyond the labels we used to give each other. Atheists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, we were all human, all trying to figure out the same question. What is the point of all this? I stopped judging. I stopped seeking approval. I started seeking presence, intention, compassion. And something amazing began to happen. Although many still looked at me with suspicion, others approached me. A classmate I had never spoken to before told me that he felt inspired by the calm conversations I was now starting. A teacher called me over after class and commented on how my posture had changed, how I seemed more centered. I wasn't trying to be an example. I was just trying to be real, someone guided by love, not by the pride of faith. And inside me, a soft voice, the same one I heard in that light, whispered, "Go on. This is how it begins." Instead of debating, I looked to understand. Even when he disagreed, he tried to listen. Little by little, some people began to notice. "Idris, you're calmer, more open. It's good to see that," said a teacher one morning with a smile that seemed sincere. But not everyone welcomed my change. Some friends drifted away, especially when I stopped participating in critical, intolerant, or sarcastic conversation, which, I admit, I also used to have. At first, it was lonely, like walking through a desert where only I knew the destination, but I knew I was on the right path. Over time, the small acts of kindness I chose to perform began to create a new kind of strength within me. Even though no one knew my full story, some began to listen. And for me, that was already a start. The weeks after I returned from the hospital were a constant test of patience, faith, and most of all, integrity. Living the principles I had learned from that near-death experience required me to be firm without being inflexible, compassionate without being condescending. My family quickly realized that something in me had changed. My father, Khalid, was the first to confront this. "Idris," he said one night, as we sat in the living room, "I noticed you've been asking different questions. What kind of ideas are occupying your mind?" I tried to find the right words. I looked into his eyes, not with challenge, but with respect. "Father, I am not questioning our faith. I am trying to understand it more deeply. I want to live according to what it means to be truly faithful." He frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "And what does this mean to you? Because lately, you have been moving away from some practices. This is not what Allah teaches us." My mother, Aisha, chimed in. Her voice was soft, but filled with concern. "Maybe we should listen to Idris. He went through something unusual. Allah has his ways of guiding each of us." I sighed. I knew it was now or never. "Mom, Dad, I saw something. While I was unconscious, it was more than a dream. It was a truth." I swallowed hard. I saw Jesus Christ. The silence was immediate, thick as the air before a storm. He did not condemn our faith. I continued, my voice firm. But it showed me that in the end, what matters is love and compassion, not just the rituals, not just the names, but the way we treat each other. My father looked at me as if searching for something in my face, a sign of delirium perhaps. But my mother, her eyes full of tears, held my hand. "Do you believe this came from Allah?" she asked in a thin voice. "Yes," I replied without hesitation, because everything I saw made me realize that what really matters is living with an open heart, helping others, no matter who they are. In the following days, my father became more silent. He observed my actions. Maybe he hoped it was just a phase, or that I would return to being the obedient, strict son he had molded me into. But I wasn't rebelling. I was rebuilding. And then one night, something changed. During dinner, he looked at me differently. His gaze, usually hard and pragmatic, was more human. "Idris," he said, slowly placing the cutlery on the table, "you got me thinking. Maybe I've been focusing too much on the rules and forgetting what they really mean." My mother smiled, surprised. And for the first time since everything that happened, I felt harmony between the three of us. Our home, previously sustained by silent repetitions and obligations, began to transform. Little by little, we opened space for true dialogue. We spoke about faith in a lively way, not just in a doctrinal way. We discussed how we could apply what we believe, outside of prayers, outside the walls of the mosque, outside our bubble. How to use faith to improve someone's life. How to use love to heal the world, even if just a little. My personal transformation began to inspire change beyond the walls of my home. My small community, made up largely of Muslim families, began to notice the changes in me. Some people began to ask me why I was acting so differently. A young woman named Layla, whom I knew from the mosque, came to me one day after Maghrib prayer. "Idris, I heard you've been helping that Christian neighbor. This is unexpected. Why are you doing?" I smiled and replied simply, "Because he is my neighbor. He is part of our community. Isn't that what our faith teaches us? To help everyone." She thought for a moment and, to my surprise, started helping me with one of the actions I organized, distributing food to those in need on the weekend. These small steps began to multiply. My family, my community, and even my friends began to see that my transformation was not a rejection of our faith, but rather a deepening of it. And eventually, my home, once a place of ritual and obligation, became a space where love, compassion, and purpose guided our action. 2 years have passed since that day that changed my life forever. Although the intensity of that experience still lives in my memory, it has become part of my daily life, shaping my choices and interactions. I am not a religious leader, nor do I give lectures or write books. My life remains simple, but it is precisely in this simplicity that I have found a greater purpose. Dearborn, with its vibrant Muslim community, has always been a place where traditions are passed on with pride. But in recent years, I've come to realize that small actions can have big repercussions. I'm not someone who gives public speeches, but I try to be a living example of what I've learned. On Fridays, after prayers at the mosque, I started organizing small groups for community action. It wasn't a formal thing, just an invitation for those who wanted to help. Some of us visited isolated elderly people, while others collected food for families in need. The impact was silent, but significant. A Christian neighbor, the same one I had helped years before, told me, "Idris, you made me believe that there is still goodness in the world." My community began to change too. People who had previously focused solely on their own practices began to look outward, asking how they could be of service to others. It was as if a new energy had been injected into our city, a sense of unity that transcended religious and cultural barriers. My family is now a constant support. My father, who was once rigid in his beliefs, has become more open. He has spoken at our family gatherings about the importance of looking beyond appearances, of seeking the spirit of faith, not just its form. "Idris," he told me once, while we were in the backyard watering the plants, "you taught me something I never realized before. It doesn't matter how many prayers we say, if our hearts are closed to others, we are missing the whole point." My mother, as always, was my biggest advocate. She found ways to weave the lessons I brought with the traditional teachings of Islam. When we talked, she would always say, "Allah has guided you in a special way. Now your task is to show others how they can be guided too." My mission is not to convert people to a religion or a specific way of thinking. It is simply to help people see what I saw, that love and compassion are at the center of everything. I've discovered that I don't need grand gestures to make an impact. It's the small, everyday actions, helping a stranger, listening to someone in need, forgiving those who've hurt me, that create bigger ripples than we can imagine. I still think about Jesus Christ and the light that radiated from him. His message was simple, yet powerful. Live with love, spread compassion. The rest will follow. These words guide everything I do. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I will continue to live by what I have learned. My story is not about one big miracle, but about the power of small changes and conscious choices. It doesn't matter who you are or what you believe. We all have the ability to transform the world around us. Today, when I walk the streets of Dearborn, I see my city through different eyes. I see potential. I see connections. I see possibilities for unity. And most of all, I see hope.